This section explains why consciousness resists the move that dissolved earlier mysteries. Consciousness cannot be dissolved the way life was. Elan vital vanished once we saw how DNA makes living matter. It was an explanatory posit, discardable the moment a better mechanism arrived. Experience is the inverse. It is not something posited to explain another thing, but the thing itself demanding explanation. What Chapter 1 calls an explanandum in its own right. The eliminate and replace trick has nothing to bite on. The pencil anchor lands it. Attend to one pencil, and you are forced into two irreconcilable stuffs, the yellow as you see it, and the object that drops when released. Adopt materialism, and the split merely resurfaces elsewhere. The chapter's role in the arc is to fix the problem as irreducible before any later theory claims to solve it. This section explains why consciousness cannot be dissolved the way earlier scientific mysteries were. Every mystery that science has ever dissolved was opposite. Elan vital, caloric fluid, each was a placeholder invented to explain something else, discardable the moment a real mechanism arrived. When DNA came, elan vital went. When energy was understood, caloric fluid went. The chapter's move is to show that consciousness cannot go this way. Experience is not what explains. It is what needs explaining. The explanandum, never an explanatory posit. So the eliminativist reflex, the expectation that increasing knowledge will retire the word, mistakes the category. This is the asymmetry. The whole book will worry. Knowing everything about neurons, firing, damage, and drugs leaves untouched why any of it is felt at all. Chalmers' hard problem is just this, residue named. The chapter exists to install that distinction, the one wall no amount of brain science climbs. This section fixes what consciousness is by pointing at it, rather than defining it from outside. A system is conscious exactly when there is something it is like to be. Nagel's-Bat fixes that definition ostensibly by pointing rather than describing. The chapter's whole move is to identify consciousness with subjectivity, a fact indexed to a point of view. You could catalog every behavior, function, and mechanism from the outside and still not have captured it, because what consciousness is lives in the having of a point of view. You can know everything third person about echolocation and still not cross into the bats inside. That gap does not come from missing data. It holds because the fact is positional. This is the primitive the rest of the book runs on. Phenomenal consciousness, blocks P, the what it is like, stands set against mere access. And with it comes the intuition, soon to be interrogated. That experience always overflows what can be reported. This section explains how the chapter fixes what the word consciousness denotes. Consciousness gets fixed by an existential quantifier. Binding a first-person indexical, there is something it is like to be X, rather than by naming any substance. Nagel's-Bat is the anchor. Master echolocation completely, every click and every Doppler correction, and the residue left untouched is what the word denotes. The move defines the phenomenon by the existence of a point of view, never by a third-person property. That residue survives total objective description. This is Bloch's phenomenal consciousness, split off from access, the being, it, that outruns the reporting of it. The boundary the chapter draws lands exactly at the bat. Full mechanism in hand, subjectivity still whole. Knowing, what, and being, like. Something come apart there, This part explains the third structural primitive, the grand illusion. An ordinary illusion puts a gap between the world and the percept. The cafe wall lines look bent, but they aren't. Blackmore's move is to recurse that same gap one level inward between your seeing and your belief about your seeing. The visual field seems a rich, complete, continuous picture. Change blindness and inattentional blindness. Show it isn't. You hold almost nothing. So the deception isn't about what's out there, but about the nature of experiencing itself. That is the whole chapter's engine and its place in the book. An illusion does not mean does not exist. It means not what it appears. Once you can turn that lens onto vision, you can turn it onto consciousness, free will, and the self. Every later chapter reuses it. This section explains the third chapter's move and why illusion is the right lens for it. An illusion is something that is other than it appears, rather than something that fails to exist at all. The chapter takes that lens and turns it inward, off the world and onto seeing itself. The ordinary illusions, the Muller-Lyer arrows and the cafe wall pattern, fool you about what is out there. The grand illusion proposes something sharper, that you are fooled about what seeing itself is. The grand illusion proposes something sharper, that you are fooled about what seeing its picture-like experience may not be the actual output of the machinery. The generative primitive here is that introspective seeming is itself falsifiable data, rather than bedrock. What it feels like from the inside can be wrong and can be tested. Vision is chosen as the anchor because it feels most essential and because it is most closely equated with knowing. So if the doubt bites here, it bites everywhere. This is why chapters 1 and 2 had to first loosen the grip of intuition. Only a distrusted first person can be examined. This section explains how neuroscience isolates the correlates of consciousness. Hold the input fixed, let experience change, and whatever neural activity tracks the experience rather than the stimulus is a correlate of consciousness. That single subtraction is the whole program of the chapter. Binocular rivalry, studied by Logophetis, is the clean instance. The photons are identical, yet the percept flips. Cells in inferior temporal cortex flip along with the monkey's report, while V1 stays loyal to the input. The move isolates consciousness as an experimental variable without ever saying what it is. That is its place in the book's arc, a method that brackets the hard problem rather than dissolving it. A correlate is not a cause, and finding where consciousness happens merely reposes the mystery at a smaller address. This section explains how the science of consciousness sidesteps a problem it cannot yet solve. A hard problem you cannot solve, you replace with a tractable neighbor you can measure. That substitution is the whole chapter. Rather than explain how gray tissue produces experience, the neuroscience of consciousness hunts the neural correlate, whatever brain activity reliably covaries with a state being conscious rather than not. It is found by the contrastive method. Hold the stimulus the same, compare the conscious case against the unconscious case, and subtract. Correlation is chosen precisely because it brackets cause. The slogan, "Correlations before cause," is the honest admission that the explanatory gap is deferred, not closed. Underneath sits a prior question that splits the whole field. Does the brain alone suffice? Identity theorists and eliminativists say yes. Embodied mind and extended mind. Theorists say the body and the world are constituents too. The Mysterians say we will never know. This section explains why picturing consciousness as a show quietly smuggles back the very thing you meant to remove. The seductive error is spatial. The moment you picture consciousness as a show, images on a screen presented to a watcher, you have quietly reinstalled the thing you meant to abolish. Dennett's move is to name it. Cartesian materialism is what remains when you drop Descartes' soul but keep his stage, a privileged place in the brain where it all comes together and someone to whom it comes. The tell is the audience. An audience needs its own inner theater, and the regress never closes. So here is the generative primitive. Any account positing a finish line where a rival order becomes experienced, order is Cartesian, however loudly it swears materialism. Hume already warned us that the comparison must not mislead us. This section explains Cartesian materialism, the target of both Dennett and this chapter. Discard Descartes' soul, but keep the stage it played on, and Cartesian materialism is what you get. The seduction is spatial. Consciousness feels like a place where contents arrive, where it all comes together, and where someone watches. Strip away the immaterial audience and the intuition still survives, now as a finish line in the brain, a point where order of arrival becomes order of experience. The chapter's move is to expose that assumption hiding inside ordinary phrasing. A stimulus enters consciousness. We speak of the contents of consciousness. We speak of the contents of consciousness. The primitive to carry is this. A metaphor you never consciously chose is still doing your metaphysics. Name the theater, and you can finally ask where or whether it is. This section explains why one conscious world is hard to reconcile with the brain that produces it. You have one conscious world, and yet it comes from a brain that is nothing but parts firing at different speeds along different routes, with no place where they converge. That gap is the chapter's whole engine. James called consciousness an integral thing, not made of parts, and that stands against a brain doing massively parallel, non-instantaneous processing. The generative move is to notice that the question can be attacked 3 ways. First, you can make the mind do the unifying, which is dualism, and that is unworkable. Second, you can find how the brain binds features into one object in real time, which is the binding problem, the flipping coin. Third, you can deny the explanandum. Perhaps unity is illusory, and the task becomes explaining the delusory. That third option is the one that does the work. The chapter's job in the arc is to make you doubt that the thing you are explaining is real. This section explains why the unity of consciousness is a puzzle to be solved rather than a fact to take for granted. Nowhere in the brain does everything arrive at once. There is no single place, no shared clock. Signals crawl at different speeds down different fibers, with color resolving before motion, and yet experience presents a single world now. That gap is the whole chapter. Unity is the explanandum, the thing to be explained, never the given. The move, inherited from the no theater result of chapter 5, is this. Unity cannot be a place where it all comes together, because there is no such where. So it must be either actively manufactured or, and this is the chapter's live wager, illusory, a delusory, a delusory, a delusory, a delusion that needs its own account. The atypical cases are the probe, split brains, synesthesia, neglect, and amnesia. Each one takes unity apart. Each one exposes that what feels seamless and partless was assembled all along. This section explains how the attention chapter escapes an old definitional deadlock by changing the question. William James said, "Everyone knows what attention is." Harold Pashler said, "No one knows what attention is." The chapter turns that deadlock into a move you can reuse. Stop asking what attention is. Ask instead how it relates to consciousness. The causal relation space between two variables is exhaustively 6. Consciousness needs attention. Attention needs consciousness. They share a common cause. They are independent. They are independent. They are identical. Or one of them is an illusion. That is the whole closed partition, and there are no other cells. Enumerating that partition beats defending any single entry. Every theory of attention, whether spotlight, filter, global workspace, or attention schema, is just a bet on which cell holds. The definition was never the object. The answer space is the object, and it is finite by construction. This section explains why one chapter of the book sets out to separate attention from consciousness. Everyone knows what attention is. No one knows what attention is. The chapter opens on that contradiction to make one structural move, to prize apart two things. Ordinary experience welds together. Attention feels like consciousness, concentrated, so the folk theory, held by James and by Hamilton, treats them as a single faculty. This chapter's job in the book's arc is to break that identity by the only decisive test, which is to find one without the other. Attention grabbed before you are aware of it. A cortically blind man's eyes smoothly tracking motion he cannot consciously see. The generative primitive is that when two phenomena co-vary in experience, you never infer identity. You hunt the dissociation. Consciousness and attention are separate axes, and the rest of the book needs them separable. This section examines the divide between conscious and unconscious, and why it may be an illusion. The near universal intuition is that mental life cleaves into two, conscious and unconscious, mind and body, reason and instinct. Here that intuition is made the suspect, not the frame. Blackmore's move is to notice that the split is asserted everywhere, in Plato, in Freud, in dual process theory, yet nowhere earned. Every claim of an unconscious process secretly posits an unexplained conscious self as its foil. This is Wegner's trap. Signal detection theory dissolves the very threshold the divide assumes. There is no fixed lineman separating what is really seen from what is not, only a shiftable criterion. So the boundary may be a magic difference, something the mind manufactures rather than finds. The chapter's job in the arc is to weaponize that doubt against an assumption the rest of the field takes for granted. This section examines the felt split between the conscious and the unconscious mind. The split you feel, the one that lets you ask what you were really conscious of, is treated here as a suspect intuition rather than a fact to build on. Blackmore's move is to deny it any fixed line to sit on. Signal detection theory does the dissolving. It replaces the single threshold with two independent knobs, sensitivity and criterion, so the same perception counts as seen or unseen, depending on nothing more than your willingness to report it. And behavior keeps registering what the report denies. Below any single line lies a whole family of boundaries, and none of them is fixed. The chapter names the reflex. It refuses the magic difference. This is the assumption that some processes make qualia and some do not, offered with no theory of why one does and the other does not. That is the Cartesian materialist habit the chapter will not accept. There may simply be no fact of the matter about which measure reveals the real content. This section explains how Blackmore reframes the free will question so it becomes answerable. The old free will question, whether we are free given determinism, is a metaphysical deadlock 2 millennia deep, wedged between inevitability and moral responsibility. Blackmore's move is to refuse that question and substitute a tractable one. Grant that humans are agents who choose, and then ask only whether consciousness does the choosing. The felt certainty that I consciously decided to get out of bed becomes the variable under test, rather than a premise. This converts an argument about the universe into an empirical question about brains. Where in the readiness potential cascade, if anywhere, does the sense of authorship enter? And does it enter as a cause, or as after the fact? Recall what an illusion means here. An illusion is something real that is simply not what it seems. It is not the same as something that fails to exist. This section explains the gap between doing something and feeling that you decided to do it. William James noticed that getting out of a cold bed happens without any felt act of deciding. You simply find that you have risen. That gap is the whole chapter. Agency itself is never in doubt. Organisms bound themselves against the world and take control of it, cats and chimpanzees included. What is in doubt is the extra sense that your conscious thought caused the action, the sense that an inner eye decided and the body obeyed. Watched from inside, the brain prepares a voluntary movement through cascading motor areas with no visible seat for that decide. The primitive to carry is this. An illusion is not something absent, it is something that is not what it seems. Free will, here, is reframed as this question about conscious authorship. This section explains how evolution and animal minds connect, and why treating consciousness as something evolution built reframes the whole question. Humans are animals, so consciousness, if it is real, is something evolution built, and the same 3-step machine that built eyes must be asked to account for it. The chapter's generative primitive is Dennett's substrate. Neutral algorithm, variation, heredity, selection, and evolution follows by necessity. No foresight, no designer, design out of chaos, without the aid of mind. Once you hold that, Paley's watchmaker dissolves, and so does the tempting ladder with humans at the summit. Darwin's tree has no privileged tip, no built-in direction, no guarantee of progress. The move Blackmore sets up is to turn that same acid on minds. If design needs no designer, perhaps what it is like needs no assent either. This part explains why the algorithm of evolution dissolves the idea of a ladder of consciousness. Design needs no designer. Variation, heredity, and differential survival compose an algorithm that grinds order out of chaos, with no foresight, no mind steering. This is Darwin's move in Chapter 10, sharpened by Dennett's 3-step. If you have variation, heredity, and selection, then you must get evolution. The chapter aims that universal acid at consciousness. The seductive error is the ladder, simple creatures below, humans at the summit, a gradient of awareness climbing toward us. A substrate, neutral algorithm has no summit and no privileged product. Humans are one chance twig on a straggly bush. Kill the ladder, and every branch of the bush earns its own question. What is it like to be that creature, with no scale ranking the answers? This section explains why the ordinary evolutionary account of function breaks down when you turn it on consciousness. Evolution answers. Why? By maiming what a trait does. Wings for flight, fur for warmth. Turn that same lens on consciousness and it jams, because a function is a causal difference, and whether experience makes any causal difference at all is exactly what is in dispute. That single pivot generates the entire chapter. Grant behaviorally identical zombies and the question dies, consciousness could confer nothing, so its evolution stays dark. deny them, and the answer space partitions cleanly. Under that denial, 3 prongs open. Consciousness is a separable adaptation with its own function, which Humphrey takes to be a social one, or it is an unavoidable byproduct of evolving those skills, or it is an illusion we were selected to fall for. The chapter is that fork itself, held open across all 3 prongs rather than settling on any one of them. This section explains why the question of what consciousness is for cannot stand on its own. Evolution answers a why question by naming what a trait does, but that inference only bites when the trait does real work. The chapter's whole move is to refuse the reflex that Humphrey makes obvious. We are conscious, so consciousness must be adaptive, so go find its function. Being evolved is a separate matter from being adaptive. A trait can be a byproduct or not a separately selectable trait at all. And if consciousness is epiphenomenal, it has no causal work for selection to act on. So the question, what is consciousness for, does not stand free. It presupposes that experience does something, which is exactly what is unsettled. The function question sits downstream of the causation question, and the chapter's job is to expose that dependency, not to resolve it. This section explains how the chapter about machine evolution turns one ancient anxiety inside out. The old worry, am I a machine, loses all traction once biology explains perception, memory, and thought. The living question becomes what kind of machine you are and where consciousness sits inside it. The generative move is the hard problem run in reverse. Biology reverse engineers the brain and keeps finding mechanism with consciousness seemingly left over, building an artificial mind forward. Engineers one and asks whether consciousness gets left in. Same gap, opposite direction of approach. Both converge on the identical question, is anything extra there, or only a zombie simulating it? Machine consciousness is therefore the mind-body problem, meeting itself from the constructive side. That is why the chapter opens the book's turn from evolved minds to built ones. This section explains why the question of whether we are machines split into 2 engineering directions that meet at a single unresolved residue. The question, am I a machine, stopped being the real question once biology answered yes. The live question became, what kind of machine? And the spine of the chapter is that this splits into 2 directions converging on one residue. The first direction is to reverse. Engineer the brain until every mechanism of perception, memory, and thought is explained. The second is to forward engineer a mind by building something that does what brains do. Both roads, at their end, hit the identical question, is anything left out? Rationality was the surprise. It fell to machines trivially, so it can no longer mark consciousness. What resists is felt understanding. Substrate neutrality makes a built mind conceivable in principle. Whether the simulation is the thing itself is precisely what neither direction settles. This section explains why an altered state of consciousness has no definition of its own. An altered state has no positive definition. It exists only as a difference from a normal baseline. And that baseline cannot be pinned down either, so the whole concept floats on a contrast between 2 things, neither of which is fixed. Push on what is altered and it dissolves. You never find a dial-marked consciousness to turn, only shifts in attention, memory, arousal, and perception. Blackmore's move is to refuse the separate substance. The state is the configuration of ordinary functions, a point in a phenomenal state space, not a thing hovering above them. The same eliminativist question returns. Is there an experience apart from what the person does and says? Altered states of consciousness are where that question bites hardest. This section explains why an altered state of consciousness has no stable ground to be defined against. An altered state presumes a normal one to deviate from, and that anchor won't hold still. Blackmore's opening move for Section 5 is dissolution does. Define altered states by induction. Which drug, which dose, and identical stimuli yield unlike states. Define them physiologically, and no unique signature maps onto experience. Define them subjectively, and the baseline of normal varies as wildly as the alteration does. The deeper cut asks, what is altered? It finds no single consciousness. Dial. Only farthings, 14 ordinary functions, attention, memory, arousal, and so on, shifting together with nothing left over to call consciousness itself. The chapter opens the borderlands with a question rather than a map. Figure 13.2 asks how many dimensions one would even need to draw one. This section explains how the brain builds both perception and imagination from a single mechanism. One machine builds the world whether or not anything is out there, filling your retinal blind spot, seeing the whole cat behind the chair, the hallucinated golden tunnel, the false memory of the beach, all run the same, generate and test loop, selecting the hypothesis that minimizes prediction error. Sensory input only constrains the guess. It never originates it. Real and imagined are therefore one process wearing a later verdict. That verdict is reality monitoring, a fallible skill that weighs stability, vividness, controllability, and source. Russell's blade, in chapter 14, cuts here. The hallucination is a fact. Only the judgment placed on it can be wrong. The chapter's work in the arc is to dissolve the objective and subjective border that the whole book's problem stands on. This section explains why perception and imagination cannot be told apart at their source. Perception and imagination run on one generator. Real versus imagined is a label the brain stamps afterward onto its own products. The Perky effect and false memories are the symmetric proof. A real tomato, judged imagined, an invented childhood judged remembered. The classifier fails both ways because it sits downstream of and separable from what it classifier fails, both ways because it sits downstream of. Reality discrimination is therefore a graded skill. The borderlands open where its confidence thins. Consider the chapter's place in the arc. It takes the grand illusion, suspicion, that you construct what you see, and extends the same construction to memory, dreaming, and hallucination. This section explains the method behind the chapter on dreaming and the states that lie beyond ordinary waking. The whole approach is to push consciousness off its waking operating point and then watch what fails to survive. Dreams, lucid dreams, hypnagogia, sleep paralysis, out-of-body, and near-death states are what Blackmore calls perturbations. Each one disrupts the default assumption of a self looking out from behind the eyes so that the seams of that assumption become visible. The casualty that matters most is timing. Ask when a dream is actually experienced, live during sleep or assembled on waking, and no clean answer holds. REM sleep turns out to be neither necessary nor sufficient for dreaming. The chapter's own question, who is the dreamer, dissolves in the same way. These border states are not curiosities. They are natural experiments run to break the reified self and expose what was never solid to begin with. This section explains how the chapter uses borderland states of consciousness to expose the seams in the self. Every apparent unity of waking consciousness, one self, located behind the eyes, experiencing the world in real time, is a binding the brain performs, not a fact it reports. The chapter's method is dissociation. Enter a borderland state where one thread of that binding slips and watch what comes apart. Lucid dreaming prise, knowing you dream apart from sleeping. Sleep paralysis prise. Perception loose from the motor block that normally silences dream movement. Out of body and near death experiences felt self-location from the body it claims to inhabit. Each is one natural experiment on the same claim, that the conscious self looking out from inside the skin is assembled, and what assembles can be shown its seams. This section explains the single fork that every theory of self runs into. Every theory of self splits at one question. Is the felt experiencer real, or is experiencer merely a name for the experiences themselves? This is Parfit's cut. Ego theories keep a continuing entity that has the experiences, owns the body, and bears moral weight. Bundle theories keep only the experiences and treat the unity as an illusion assembled afterward. The Buddha's Anatta and Hume both take the second branch. What makes the fork inescapable is this: the I. The thing that seems obviously present behind every experience is itself the disputed term. It cannot serve as a neutral seat from which to judge, because it is exactly what the two sides are arguing about. The chapter is this single binary. Every later puzzle, from splitting to dissociation to teleporters, stress tests which branch survives. This section explains the fork that organizes the whole chapter. Two ways to answer why it seems there is a single, continuous me having these experiences. The first way is the ego theories. On this view, the seeming is true. Some persisting entity really is the subject, the decider, the thing that survives. The second way is the bundle theories. This is Parfit's coinage, with the Buddha and Hume as its patriarchs. Here the seeming is real, but the entity is not. The word self is only a name pinned to a collection, the way the word carriage names a set of parts with no extra part that is the carriage itself. The generative move is this. Ask of any felt unity whether it denotes a substance or merely labels a bundle. Note that this fork is orthogonal to dualism. Materialists sit on both sides,